All right, welcome to Culture Couch Live this week, and there's a little bit of a got an American / Australian flavour to it. So I've got my American friend here, Chris Olsen, who's working with us out of California, which is awesome. Chris, and our next guest, I'm going to let you introduce Jim, even though Jim and I have known each other probably, gee whiz, we're just reminiscing now. It's a bit too far to worry about how long it is, sort of thing. So, but Jim, welcome. But I'll hand it over to you, Chris, and you can introduce our guest for today's Culture Couch Live.
Well, Jim was one of the first Aussies I think I ever actually met. So
Jim really?
Cooper, who's the what was that?
Was I really?
Yeah, I think so, actually. Yeah, as we started doing that. But Jim's the CTO of Braid Theory, a company based out of LA Harbor here in Southern California, and a good friend of mine going back 25 years when I got introduced to footy, and was one of the original guys who brought footy to the United States. So Jim, welcome to Culture Couch Live.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rizzy. I appreciate the intro, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Look, we're really excited about talking business, obviously, but I think part of that connection is obviously the Australian connection to America. And Chris and I have been going around and meeting clearly a lot of great Aussies who know my story, and obviously Chris is one of those strange Americans that plays Australian rules footy, as you know, Jim, sort of thing. But I just want to talk to you a little bit about that sporting connection. You know, you coming to America, 20 plus years ago, and obviously starting a business. How do you sort of go into that Australian sporting connection with your own business? Because it's been such a big part of the evolution of Australian rules football. And I know you and Chris talk a lot about the Bloods culture, et cetera, et cetera. But how much of that vernacular and how much of that really permeates through your business?
I try my best to introduce as much as I can about what I know. Growing up in Australia and having Australian rules football as a kind of a central part of my life, and then playing Australian rules football and then immersing myself in kind of the coaching culture as well. I've tried to inject a little bit of that. Insofar as Americans can understand it, what I've tried to do is leverage my experience in other aspects of my job, my career, my experience, and then make a parallel to what I've done with Australian rules football, and continue to do as I continue to play and run around with the boys with the football. So yeah, I'm still very active in the Australian football community here, and so yeah, I try my best with the limitations that people don't really don't know a lot about football, and trying to explain it. Sit down for 15 minutes and let me explain to you without having to go into that. I try and bring as much as I can into the conversation.
And Chris, I'll ask you a similar question, but I'm sure you and Jim have had some conversations similar to your and my conversations, being that American who started playing Australian rules football and watching the evolution of the Swans and the transition of, I guess, the culture of Australian rules football. What are some of those conversations you and Jim have had around, both through sport but outside of sport?
Yeah, I think a lot of it kind of goes, especially with Jim's work as it relates to startups and that sort of thing. And obviously my experience or knowledge of what happened with Sydney and the correlations that I've seen in sport. And that's where I thought it would be interesting as Jim's dealing with startups, that aspect of it. A lot of times we just want to get in and do the work and fulfill our dreams without being maybe as deliberate about some of the things we genuinely want to stand for. And so yeah, Jim.
Chris is being really humble here. There have been times when Chris and I have kind of had almost knock 'em down punch outs because we've disagreed on things like on issues around development. Chris has always been a go-getter and really, really kind of wanted things like, even when we started having Australian rules football here in California, wanted us to punch above our weight. And I was really very much into the fundamentals of the game. No, Chris, we've got to get into the fundamentals. We have to take a step back, and we need to make sure that everyone knows how to handball correctly, and everyone needs to know how to kick correctly, and everyone needs to know what the field size is, and we need to, and I think I think we need both.
Yeah.
I think we need the Chris's and I think we need the Jims
Yeah.
to kind of give us, and especially when we're dealing with companies, you know, I have had a long experience with startups, 20 years in startup world. And I think that the best, what I've noticed is that the best startup founding teams have that mixture of what Chris and I have had. And it's actually really good. So I think that's a testament to our friendship and how we've kind of it has never come to blows, but you know, it is that tension and that debate that allows us to then move forward, to form a consensus or build a consensus and move forward.
I think it's a great point, Jim, because we're talking to a lot of startups and we're actually got a lot of startups as clients, but typically, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, startups really probably come from a technical idea. They never come from a cultural idea, do they? It's not like the three of us would sit around and go, let's start a car company and base it purely around culture. Let's start a car company because we've got this really good car, so it's a really interesting point. So is that one of the biggest challenges, is to, when does the culture sort of fit in? Because, raising funds and getting staff and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we see is we're really pushing them to get it done as quickly as they possibly can and build around it. To your point, the technical expertise seems to be there a lot, not always, because they're starting with smaller groups fundamentally. But what's your opinion on that?
I think as startups grow, they often forget that there's an existing culture that happens from the founder-led team. And then as they kind of start to build and grow, they forget about it. And often that culture has been fixed very, very early. So no one really kind of concentrates on thinking, okay, what do we want out of that culture going forward? My opinion is that I think that while you don't need to think about it day one, certainly day 2, day 3, day 4, you should probably start thinking about what you want to have as an internal culture and how much of that internal culture you want to create as an external message. So how much of that do you want to articulate to others? And is that a message that you want to convey when you want to have new employees, new hires? So I think it needs to be spoken about very early, and it's often neglected. And I think that the key fabric of that is ambiguity. I don't think that you can afford to be ambiguous about it, because as you grow and you start to add people to that team, there are sometimes competing communication styles that then create an ambiguity in the culture if you don't figure it out very early.
One of the things, it's funny as you're saying this, right? And I'm kind of putting myself back into that startup mode in what we were going through. And I think one of the things I've seen now, to be able to have 5 months into this role with PBD, is really understanding what building a culture actually is. And I think sometimes we think it's like a birthing and it's going to be a bit painful and uncomfortable. But it's something, if I just sit down and do it and get it done and then move on with. And what I've really come to learn with PBD now is that your culture code and your purpose, it's a living and breathing entity, that it needs check-ins over time. It doesn't need a week's worth of, going off to some remote location to grind it out. It's, hey, let's sit down for a day and just have a discussion about some very simple things that we stand for, and then check back in with it in a couple months and kind of evaluate where we were. Can we peel some of this out, add some things in as we're actually doing the work? And I think if people kind of looked at it from that standpoint, that it isn't the stress of, we just have to make this and be done with it, and it is actually a breathing entity.
Yeah, the technical feasibility aspect for a lot of the startups that I deal with, particularly in engineering and science, that often breeds a sense of culture, because they've come from like a science background or an engineering background, And so they're very stoic about how they want to proceed with a corporate culture. And often it's not like that. It's more like when I used to play football back at home. I grew up in the eastern suburbs. I played footy for Inner West, but sometimes we had to go out to Campbelltown and Balcombe Hills to play football, which are completely different cultures, and yet they're within a 50-mile radius. And I think that you have to be flexible in your approach. Otherwise, it leads to that ambiguity, and others don't know how to take you.
I think you made a really good point about the word I like, Jim, is intentional. Because like you said, like startups start with people, obviously, and people have certain personalities. And as you mentioned, a couple of industries, particularly engineering, very analytical, very analytical. So organically, you become that personality of the person. And you mentioned before, is that what you want? But if you're intentional about your culture, you can actually create the culture you want, not based on the personalities of the individual, but based on the discussion around what do we want to be. It's a really good way to start your culture. What do we want to stand for? What do we want to be? What values do we want to, and what behaviors are we seeing that are counterproductive? So that's the intentional part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I've been guilty of that a lot. And even when I try and fix stuff that's around that intentionality, I mess it up. I think that without having someone there to help guide you through that process, I think you fall into bad practices, and you don't want to do that, because if you're building a startup company, this is going to be your life probably for 10, 20 years before you get to a point where it's going to be an exit or something. You get bought out, or a merger and acquisition, IPO, whatever it might be. And you have to stick with it. So to have some kind of guidance around that is really, really helpful. And often it has to start day two. You form your company day one, day two, start thinking about all those fundamentals, including culture.
It's funny you say that, Jim, because it's funny. We've been having a lot of discussions internally about, just understanding our clientele, understanding our business better, and why do PBD clients choose us? And it kind of speaks to, when you look at the client base, we've got really high performing companies that is the vast majority of our clientele. And it's those leaders who are looking for that almost external accountability that they trust to show the mirror to. And I think that can be a challenge.
What was that song from the 90s? Check yourself before you wreck yourself, right? It's a lot like that, right?
Yeah, right.
You have to, and I think you don't want to make mistakes. I think people generally don't want to make mistakes, and yet it's mistakes that help us to learn. So we've got to skirt this. I don't want to make bad mistakes. I'm fine with making little mistakes that don't really matter that much. But no one really wants you to fall, because then there's too much at stake. There's stakeholder engagement. You might lose that stakeholder engagement if you make too much of a mistake. So I think that people want to. I think it's more or less, and they want to adjust. There's during World War II, there was this the German military had this expression called Fingerspitzengefühl, which means fingertips feeling. And it was this idea that you could just manipulate the battlefield just by this tiny minutia. And I think that once you set something out, then all you need to do is make these little fine-tune adjustments. And I think that that's what we're kind of talking about with culture.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Dad. But it's to Chris's point. Often, it's not so much that the CEO or the owner of the startup doesn't want the accountability. They're probably not used to it, because again, it comes from an idea. Most of the time, it's just this idea. But the idea of accountability is sort of pushed. Every other idea is sort of pushed to the side, because the idea at the front of the mind is the idea that you said. Yeah, they're looking at 10, 15, 20 years. And that's the thing that I think really people have got to get their head across. How can companies like PBD help us with accountability? And then, to your point, Jim, about the second day or third day or whatever it is, it will just allow your company, allow you to bring that idea to the forefront and allow PBD to bring the accountability to you. But it's a really visualization, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I think it's that guidance that teams need, and companies need to be able to be flexible, which I think is the other portion of culture. Flexibility is a huge part of culture. I see that flexibility or agility is probably one of the most important things that the startup can have as part of their culture. That culture toolbox.
Actually, it was interesting because one of my former CEOs, when I was coaching the Swans, he did a talk, and the first time I heard him say it, he talked about footy clubs as being a startup every year, and it was actually quite interesting when he said it, because he's actually quite right. So maybe talk to that, because that philosophy is that season's finished, and we have to start again. It's very much like that in a footy club, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got especially as you start a new business cycle for startups, launching a new product. It might be entering a new market territory, going from Southern California to somewhere completely unknown, like say Canada or Europe, and then having to relaunch and redo and have new hires and everything. It's a bit like having a list at the footy club. Yeah. And then you've got rookies, and you've got seasoned players, and you've got players that have really good technical chops, and then you've got utility players that can kind of play a couple of positions on the field, and then of course you've got all the other kind of back office people, the ones who manage the interchange bench, and the rest who can observe the playing field and kind of tell you where there's a gap. I think those are the true challenges that we have, and it's identical. I mean, there's not just a similarity.
Yeah, it's identical. Yeah,
it's absolutely identical. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It is every time we talk about sport and business, there's so many similarities. I mean, the NBA playoffs are on at the moment, and you look at even Phoenix. Phoenix halfway through the season ended up with Kevin Durant, one of the great players of all time. And LA Lakers retooled their whole organization and kept, I think, LeBron and AD and a number of others. But it's interesting, even when you look at the NBA playoffs, how quickly they were able to, and it's a little bit like that for startups, isn't it? Like, you can quickly tool yourself if you know the right things to do, isn't it? And that's that ability, that self-awareness piece, isn't it? No leader is perfect. Have some really good self-awareness, and whether the technical aspect, the cultural aspect, ask someone.
Yeah, Paul, although I really wish sometimes leaders, and especially leaders at startups, would get out of their own way.
Yeah, 100%.
I really, really do. And we often see this as a real problem, particularly solo entrepreneurs. Like, if they're the sole founder of their startup, and as they grow, they set the company culture. Yeah. It's often very, very hard to get them out of their own way. It really, really is. It's one of the hardest things. I always put it back to the music industry, where you've got solo artists, and you've got them and they're in a band, say like the Rolling Stones, and then each of the Rolling Stones members have their own solo careers. Well, I've listened to the Rolling Stones, and I think the Rolling Stones are great. I'm not so keen about their solo careers.
Yeah.
It's a great point.
Without other people checking you, and having that accountability, then you're not going to make as successful a career as you are altogether.
Well, I think that's one of the big things as a startup goes through those phases, or a sporting company or a sporting club is starting a new season, is when you have a culture code and your values and behaviors defined, the new people coming in don't just start unpacking their baggage willy-nilly. That those structures kind of provide some guardrails within which everybody is kind of operating, right? There's some role modeling going on. we can see kind of what's going on, and that culture kind of feeds on itself. So
Sure, but I think that people entering into those companies already know about the existing culture that's there.
Yeah,
and that's probably what attracts them to that particular culture. So I don't think that, and I also think it's important, and this is where that kind of, you know, inflexibility kind of comes in, is that I don't think that startups should neglect the fact that those people bring an important aspect of culture to the system as well. So as they're unpacking, as you say, they are providing new aspects of a culture that can then grow a new flavor within the corporate culture that currently stands. So I think we need to be we need to loosen those chains a little bit, and kind of expand the guardrail to allow for new culture expansion.
And that's that review process, Chris, you were talking about, isn't it? What I like, Jim, and we talk about this all the time, culture travels. You're absolutely right. Gee, I've got to go and work for Jim. Yeah, I don't exactly know what he's doing, but there's a bit of noise around it. So I'm going to go. And then all of a sudden I get there. Chris comes in from PBD, does the review. Ruzi, what are you seeing as the newest person? I think this is great, but I actually think we can add that. And that's exactly what you're talking about. That's that accountability model. And I love that. I love culture travels, because people sometimes forget that. Oh, it's an internal. It's not internal. If you get it right internally, then it just spreads everywhere. There's been an amazing conversation. I'm going to ask you a question first, Chris. So what attracts you and Jim? Jim had a bit of a joke about that sort of headbutting before, but what I love to ask about people, tell us about Jim as a leader, and without embarrassing him, but clearly we connect with people that have similar values. What gravitates to Jim in terms of that leadership model?
I think I don't have a lot of people in my life that challenge me on my ideas.
Yeah.
And what I love about Jim is he's one of the most intelligent guys I know. We think almost politically, we almost occupy opposite spectrums, but I always love the conversations. And as much as we have really spirited conversations, it's always with an idea that I'm learning something. And I think, if nothing else, Jim's always open-minded enough to take on board some of my bullshit. So
awesome. And Jim, just for the listeners, what if you had to pick one thing that you see perhaps startups not doing? Like, is there one consistent or one or two things that you go, wow, this is another company and another company? And what would your advice be to people thinking of starting a company right now?
Articulating value. I mean, there is really, sure, you want to solve a problem, and that's great, but you've got to be able to provide a customer with value, and that value has to stand some time testing. It needs to last a long time. Value is more than, sometimes it's intangible. It's not just about cheaper, faster, or better. It can be other things too. And even a part of that might be the culture that you bring. Maybe it's a culture of service. Maybe it's a culture of guaranteeing good workmanship. There's a lot of things that fit into that. So I think that value is definitely the one thing that people should be identifying and articulating.
Yeah, I love that, because we provide value. I think it's really good. One of the things that in starting the business in America was, do we provide value? I think that's something we've done 3 or 4 workshops now, Chris, which has been amazing. So the value that we've provided out, it's a really good way to look at it. Mate, that's an awesome conversation, and always good to catch up with you, Jim. Both
cheers, Paul.
Back a long way, but that was awesome insights, mate. Thanks very much, and thanks, Chris.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ruzi. Thanks, Jim.
All right, guys.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Ruzi.
We'll see you next week on the Culture Cast Live. Thanks, guys.